biggest challenges maybe that we've had in forages, and Megan and I were just discussing a little bit beforehand, all the challenges to how working with forages and the concern of so many people, the fear of so many people in that forages is such a crapshoot, as one person told me. And the reality of it is, yet we see many dairy farmers and others out there, and more in the moist areas. I've got to admit, it's easier motoring through things from a consistency of success. And what does that look like and why? So certainly from that standpoint, we'll try to address this today. And I've got to admit, I'm still a real student of this. And I've got many mentors, and I'll share some of their learnings as we do this. It's not like I haven't worked at this for 30 some years and got experiences back into the 80s that my brother and I compared notes on and seeding when I was farming with him. And certainly got many ideas and learnings from there. Anyway, when we're starting, we really need to start before you think. The idea that it takes homework, and that's something that, as Megan and I were talking about, there was an Establishing High Legume Pasture video that the Lakeland Applied Research Association was part of many years ago, but it has got some terrific content from other producers. And some of those producers, of course, is a hay sales producer like Greg Selsler at Mayerthorpe had a lot of good experiences because he seeds more often than I do, or many of us. So if you're seeding every year almost, and as he said, some years I don't. So I encourage you to look at that video series, and Megan said she'd put it up on the web. But Greg said to everyone, I start before you think. And the idea is I'm setting myself up for success. So 2 years ahead of time. And a lot of that deals with the issues that you may develop after the fact. And now I've seeded it. Oh my God, look at all the weeds coming. I've seeded without a cover crop. There's weeds everywhere. I've seeded with a cover crop, or I've seeded a forage mixture. How can I spray this? Look at all the weeds. The idea behind this is to have your options and your controls in place beforehand and be ready to turn to them quite quickly. One of the big things to watch for that most people don't think about now is herbicide residues. And the reality is, with so many of our different products we use out there, it might not be an issue, but so often when we take land back or other things, you need to know what was put on that landscape beforehand. The last thing you want is nothing to grow and you wonder why. And that is something that was also said by Murray Abel from Lacombe in one of the videos, which was also marvelous. And soil testing and fertility addressed. That's two of the things that the video group also shared. And the idea is to know what the story is. And we'll talk more about this as we go through this talk. But it is very important in setting yourself up for success, amazingly important. We'll share something there. Then the seed source. Sourcing your seed in advance so you get what you want. You know what you're getting. You can ask for what you want and get what you want. The challenge of inoculating legumes. That's a challenge, unfortunately, I hate to say, and we'll talk a little bit more about it and why. Seeding at the right time with the right techniques. And certainly, as Greg Selsler said in the one video, you can seed with anything. It's the principles that are powerful and have to be addressed, but the right time too. So what is the right time? We'll talk about that as we go through. The right rate and depth. And I'm going to harp on depth till the cows come home, as the old saying goes, and my mom would use, simply because it's the biggest reason for failure. Depth in seeding too deep. People saying, I seeded shallow, yet when you go out there and start digging, they set up the seed system on the headlands at the gateway, not across a field. Why is it that it caught near the trees? the headland, of course, trees, you're turning, or near the gate, and everything caught, but it was a failing. It was the bad seed. Well, why did it catch? Did everything catch? Well, yeah. The concern you have right there is something's going wrong. Why is it going wrong? Why are certain areas catching and others not? It's depth. Weed control and insect control, because we've seen a lot of things where weeds get out of hand. What can you spray with? Getting in there quick enough and doing something about it is key here, be it weed control or silage. An insect, what do you do when a new stand's coming and there's small seedlings and grasshoppers are around? You're in trouble. You have to do something right away, and maybe depending on neighboring land, you don't have really good options even there. For the future, and this is what my brother and I found, is how you set yourself up at the start makes for the life of the stand. And we'll share something a little further on that. But thick, vigorous stands have some key principles. And the proper seeding practices generally were followed. And the favorable seed bed was a crucial component of all of this, maybe more important even than anything else. The good environmental conditions, well, it's not going to grow if it doesn't rain. Well, maybe if we seeded it in earlier May, or if we have no subsoil moisture, as Greg Seltzer would say, maybe this isn't the year I seed. I sit on my seed instead. So making those decisions, and depending on where you're attending this webinar from, of course, Megan and I have found that some people are attending from further away than just local areas. So it is more of a challenge in the dry areas than it is in the wet areas, and managing around environment. Another thing that I added to this, and I've seen so many, and we'll share in this talk, how we can address this, because fertility in establishment is key. People will say, well, there's so many things that a perennial forage can unlock of unavailable nutrients. And Dr. Yamili Zavala, who will be speaking at the Western Canadian Conference on Soil Health and Grazing next week, or 2 weeks from now, said, well, that's if they're established. If they're not established and healthy and vigorous, they're not going to be making available what is unavailable. So as weed control, to me, I'm really looking at getting out there and addressing the problems, the perennial side of problems. And we'll be talking about sod seeding as we go through this talk. So the sod seeding is going to come in the latter part of this. So some of the perennial weeds, of course, could be more true in it than they are in cultivated land. But it's certainly, if we've got thistle issues, quackgrass is quite easy to control, actually. But the thistle issues, or a perennial sow thistle, something like that, or noxious weeds, scentless chamomile, oxeye daisy, all of those things need to be dealt with ahead of time. And one of the biggest concerns I've got is the soil seed bank is immense. Almost no matter where you go, it'll be true. And so when we're doing that, we've got weeds we know about, but we've also got weed surprises coming our way. And so I'm dealing with the beforehand, but I'm also going to deal with the in-hand and afterhand. So the in-crop herbicide options after we deal with what we talked about in residues and beforehand. If we have pure stands, we got more options. Mixed stands were challenged. When so many of the mixed stands, a product like Embutox, 2,4-D-butyric, or Cobutox, are all products that maybe have a broadness of herbicide use in mixed stands, but a lot of times they don't. And as in the Grain News article, Mr. Henry had written in the fall time, I think, my mower is my best friend when it comes down to perennial forage establishment. So the idea about mowing is being on top of things to mow. And Dr. Surya Acharya, who's also part of that video series that Megan and I were talking about on Beyond the Lara website, said get out there and mow it when it's about 8 inches high. You're not going to hurt the forage seedlings because you won't also have too much residual to drop on the ground. So you're trying to take the seed set component out of the annuals and not cover and block out sunlight to the little seedlings. So you're leaving 4 inches of residual. Silage or weed herbicide or mowing all needs to be done before the canopy is in fact blocking sunlight. Once the canopy is blocking sunlight, it is like a car running out of oil. You have very little time before you're going to, in fact, have to turn off the key and hope that you haven't seized the engine. When we run out of water, as everybody says, and they're so concerned about, it actually is more like a rad hose breaking. You start seeing steam coming out from the hood. You look at your temperature gauge and go, uh-oh, but you can drive maybe to the neighbors before you can get pulled over, parked, and try to get some help. The idea with water is if we've done our homework properly, when it comes down to the canopy being a biggest issue, dealing with the competitiveness, but the reality is we can live for a little time without water as long as we've set ourselves up with a good seed bed. Nitrogen is not something I'm really looking for. It is something, if I'm seeding a cover crop, I know I'm going to have some, and I want some there even for that cover crop. But the reality is I don't care for much because it means the competition to a little seedling is going to be great. Phosphate is, of course, huge. And we've often said in the past, ban 7 years even of phosphate into the soil to be ready for. Banding is much more effective than broadcasting. And if it is banded, be careful. Banding with seed is a very low acceptance of phosphorus, about 30 pounds of product. I know people have used more. I said phosphate 50 pounds. Well, if I've got a wide band that is a 2-inch band or something, then maybe 50 pounds is okay and I should say P205. Maybe I'm a little challenged with this. Fraser, when he did this presentation, was out of the more moisture areas of Manitoba. And so even there, they've had 30 pounds of 1152. So we're not talking actual phosphorus. But 30 pounds is about as much as I'll allow in a narrow disc band, no more than that with a seed. But if I can band it off to the side or to the bottom, I can certainly increase that as distance from the seed away from the seed is there. Potassium and sulfur, both are actually very important, and if deficient, they can be applied with greater soil movement. So they can be applied more after the fact or during the time of the soil test. But if you're setting yourself up for success, try to deal with the potassium and sulfur in advance and look at them in light of trying to optimize production, because you're investing in many years of productivity and realizing that phosphorus comes first with a seedling, but potassium and sulfur come very important thereafter. The realization why phosphorus is crucial is doubling the seed size within 30 days of emergence is part of a Manitoba agriculture and food project. When they looked at a number of components, doubling the seedling size within 30 days of emergence sure tells you something about creating a vigorous seedling. The other thing that they also found in Molly and McCartney in 2004, and as well as Maffrey in 2006, as part of that support, was that 30 pounds applied during the seeding could increase alfalfa seedling size 4 times. So what about other seedlings? Well, banding double seedling size, it doesn't say legume or grass. So my comment on this is that I can't answer that other than to say it root development and the seedling vigor is crucially important, and phosphorus when put in the right place can really do big things for you. And many times when we see a lot of failings, we wonder why the seedling's lacking vigor, and some of that, as you can see here, could well be phosphorus. Forage seed quality. Now, everybody says buy quality forage seed. The ironic thing about that is when I look through certified #1 and common #1, both were pretty high quality seed. A little less germination maybe on common #1, but pretty darn high quality when it comes down to it. The thing that I found, which was very disappointing in both, there was a tolerance for primary noxious weeds of one seed, I believe, in certified #1. That could be, in fact, scentless chamomile. Common #2 may be allowed for 2 or 3, but both allowed for some noxious weed presence, seed presence. And so in my mind, get a seed certificate, ask the company for a seed certificate. And this is what a seed certificate looks like. When you ask, that seed certificate will come back with the lot number. So the certificate number, it will also have the species that was planted. It will give you the germination, the pure living seed content. It'll show weed seeds, and here we accidentally blocked it out, so my apologies, but it was 0%. Sweet clover, 0%. Brassica species, 0%. Watch out, because this is only 25-gram samples. 25 grams is someplace in the range of about 1/8 of a pound. So it is very small amount. And that's where I don't mind a seed certificate helping me out, but it's also the diligence of the company and talking to them prior to as well. Even when you deal with forage seed mixtures, they will have seed certificates for the forages that went into the mixture. And it might be the parent company you need to go to. It might be not at your local corner supplier of seed, but they can get it for you very quickly. It's just a question of a phone call. And if they really want you as a customer, and hopefully don't do it during springtime, because you know that could be really a tough one. The thing I wanted to share when people buy mixes, be very careful. Common #1 forage mixture. Okay, Grant said that isn't bad. I'm not so worried. But when it's got the percent on the bag, it is never by seed amounts. It's always by weight. So remember, Timothy, that's a very small forage seed. 5% is a lot, actually. And when I was looking at it, I believe 5% of Timothy in this mix worked out to being over 20% actually of the seed being the Timothy. So the point of that is you've got to realize, and 22% actually is what I worked it out to being, was the actual amount of seed percentage. Yes, not so many seeds are going to germinate and come because it's tiny, but it's got a lot of seeds when it compares it to a large seed like a meadow brome. So anyway, when you're dealing with mixtures, always be prepared, in fact, for the fact that what is said on the bag is by weight. And so it gives you information, but not all the information you want. Now, something that I'm kind of embarrassed about, legume rhizobial bacteria. We recommend that you use a bacterial inoculant of the correct form, a rhizobial bacteria that is suited to an alfalfa A rhizobial bacteria is different that's suited to clovers. It's different for cicer, milk vetch, birdsfoot trefoil, sandfoin, Kura clover. They all have different ones. The challenge is you cannot find inoculated seed for these legumes that is in fact approved in Canada. Canada's too small a market. This is something that the Alberta Forage Industry Network, Canadian Forage and Grassland Association have emphasized to the federal government. We need to do something about this, because the reality is we do have bacteria approved in Canada. You can get them to inoculate your clovers or your alfalfa, but when you deal with these others, you can't. And the answer is a little more complicated to it than that, because often at times native bacteria can form relationships. And if we have native vetches on our landscape, sandfoin's a vetch too, you may find that you've got fixation of nitrogen by a legume. Maybe it's not the most effective, but it is fixation. And at times, even with these other legumes. But the reality is it's a good agronomic practice, and it's cheap because we want nitrogen to be available for growth of legumes with grasses. I'm passing it by now and moving on. At this point in time, seed coating. Coating ratio, and this is true of any of the grasses generally. If they're coated, it's 50% seed, 50% coating. So when you're dealing with seed size, and I'm going to in a minute, I'm going to have to say, it's coated seed. It's half. If it's a grass, it's half the bigger. So it's double the seed size, literally, of what is written down. So when you look at it, there is some science behind this, but not enough. And therefore, my rule of thumb I use after consultation with experienced and veteran forage seed company people that have worked in the seed industry for a long time is, if I'm seeding a coated grass seed, I bump the seeding rate 25% automatically. So I'm going to bump the seeding rate of a coated grass seed by 25% to compensate for the fact there is less seed per pound. The coating is a benefit in the majority of cases, and we'll talk about that in a second, maybe. But the reality is that is it enough? The science, I do not believe, have not found to say it's enough for a grass seed. For a legume, that is a little bit of a different story, because generally what we've seen is with legumes, research from North Carolina and New Mexico have supported the fact that if a legume is coated, it's only about 34% coating. Remember, a legume's round generally. It's easier and smaller to coat. They don't need so much coating. A grass seed is oblong. It's lighter. So often it has to take a lot more to cover the surface. That's why it's 50%. It's not a company going out there trying to just put a bunch of coating on seed, though we think about. The reality is coating so often is got products in it of nutrients, starch for water absorption. It's got potentially got even a fungicide on it. It might have, and not all, but I think one company has an muscular rhizal fungi on it. So it's got different things to help it in its journey to seedlings becoming seeds to plants. And when we look at the work done, what they found was that you got the same number of plants from seeding the same weight of coated or uncoated alfalfa seed. So if somebody says, well, 8 pounds of alfalfa seeds a pure stand. If it's coated, how much do I have to put on? The science would say 8 pounds is just fine. There, and I don't have it in here, but I do have the research papers and look through it. And you've got the same number of plants in a number of experiments The challenge was it was with alfalfa, and then you heard comments from others saying legumes. I've coated legumes and have the same number. Well, it was with alfalfa, and I presume the other legumes would be the same. Seeding timing. We're really trying to gear it around a warm soil, particularly true more so with Seister milkfetch. It's a little harder to establish a legume. Some people say birds for trefoil is a little harder to establish. Some say sainfoin is. I haven't found that to be the case, actually. But take the warm soil, take it earlier in the spring that many choose, because so often it's done after I finish seeding, the middle of June. Well, it's the April, May, June rains that I count on. And I hate to give up April and May rains unless I haven't got them like this year. And this year I would have waited until into June just to see if I should go for it or not. But those people that did it earlier in the spring had the June rains to take everything and help it fly. So earlier in spring than many choose is something that in my mind is a bit of a key. We want a long season. And that's what Darlene Stein in the video establishing said. It gives us more options for control of weeds, grazing, silaging, and yet year of establishment growth. If I'm doing a dormant seeding, this is given different words by different people, but dormant simply to me means planting without expectation of growth. We're planting it in at a time when we won't get germination. We don't want germination. And at 5 degrees Celsius, we actually get some germination starting of grasses and legumes. That's why it's just before the snow flies. 2 degrees Celsius oil at seeding depth. So that's a ½ inch into the soil, ½ inch in the soil, 3/4 of an inch. What you're expecting here is growth very early next spring. You do, and I encourage you to up the seeding rates on everything because of attrition, simply of winter. Organisms may be preying on it through the winter. The reality is some frost might get some seedlings in the spring. But as I've said to many, you're gearing now, and this is more true of sod seeding than anything, but you're gearing up a winter snowfall moisture event, early spring moisture event, June moisture event, all of this to get your seedling off to a competitive start to compete against other existing vegetation, or to get a very early start in the year and hopefully get 2 cuts. One cut that's going to be a weedy silage, maybe another cut that could well end up being a pretty good crop that could be sold to somebody else. Seeding methods. I really prefer drilling. The reality is I want firm above and firm below. And with that, I've sandwiched a seed, I should say, for growth, root system, pulling moisture to itself for greatest success. However, broadcasting or Velmar, and Megan and I were talking about this just beforehand, often with broad seeds, with grasses and everything, how do you apply them? Putting them in, so you band them with fertilizer, broadcast them on, maybe you drill in your legume seed because it's more uniform in size and easier, but trying to get uniformity of seed application, my apologies, seed application to the land, uniformity, and not finishing the field and finding out that I've got all of my grass seed left in the drill, all my legumes are gone. You've got to be very on top of it with drilling. You need agitation, you need stirring. And I myself have used a Brilliant to seed a whole mixture, but you know what? I got off every round and stirred it. That sounds like a lot of work to people, but in the end, it worked well. And as Greg Selzer said in the video, I've tried all kinds of seeding methods. It's the principles, Greg said. So refer to that Establishing High Legume Pastures video, and you'll get some of the key points Greg had. And Rudy Stein, Murray Abel, and I apologize to anybody I've missed in that video, but some of the key parts to really getting the principles right. I wanted to set you up with some seeding rates because people are going to say, well, how much are you seeding?
We can't hear you, Grant.
Okay, I'm just going to switch. I don't know why this is doing this, so I'm going to switch systems.
We can hear you again.
Yeah, it's doing it again, eh?
Yep.
Wonder if now it'll pick up. No.
We can hear you now.
Okay. And so what I'm doing is I'm talking through, can you hear me now fine?
Yep.
Okay. The 25 to 30 seeds per square foot in the black and gray wood, it is more of your area type seeding up around the St. Paul Bonnyville area. But the key thing to this seeding rate is don't put too many when there isn't enough resources for them. Too many means complete failure. That's why you'll get into the brown soil zone and they just target less because they know there's less moisture to go around. And this is pure live seeds. So when you look back at that seed certificate, I'm not saying all seeds because depending on seeds, I know a lot of us look at 25 to 30 seeds per square foot. Myron Bjorge, who wrote the Alberta Forage Manual, Myron would say if it's 80% or greater, it's fine. Go with what seeding rates you've got here. So 80% pure live seed germination and such, 25 to 30 seeds per square foot is fine. So when you're building something and you're thinking of seeds per square foot, if you need to plan it, to do it with any of the target approaches that you have out there, like Forage you pick, you can do it. And the idea of how many seeds per square foot others are building for you, if you're counting on somebody else doing it, is generally around that. It is higher for Timothy, certainly, and because of very small seeds. So some are higher, but it's a rule of thumb, a solid rule of thumb. What I wanted to share is the differences. We talk in the Forage Manual, and I'm focusing on it. And as we look at the different areas of the province, and when I start looking at County of Athabasca, Bonnyville, so depending on what area you're from, the gray wooded soil area, I want to make sure, okay. What we're looking at is a seeding rate, and where I'm heading towards this is seed size and quality. I'm also going towards the seeding method discussion, and then a little bit of that climate zone that we just shared originally. Because if I'm looking at a seeding method that's broadcasting, I'm going to bump the seeding rate 20, maybe 50% even, because broadcasting will never get all of it covered. So the reality is it might be the best method for a grass seed, a large seed, a light seed. We can mix with fertilizer and apply it, but we're looking at, in fact, bumping the seeding rate because not all of it will go in the ground. And that's where we actually want a bit visible above. If I don't see any above ground in a broadcast seeding, you're seeding too deep. It is really important to consider that as you're doing it. the point I wanted to share here from the forage manual is the variance in seed size. And look at an alfalfa with 200,000 seeds per pound. If it was a yellow blossomed alfalfa, it'd actually be 300,000. So there is a difference even in alfalfas that don't, this isn't accounted for. And remember, between seed lots and everything, there always is a bit of a difference. So these are rule of thumb figures that are pretty solid. But you get to a Sandfoin, 300,000 or 30,000 versus 200,000. My goodness gracious, that's about 3/4 of a size bigger almost. So you're going to need a lot more seeds. 8 times 3 is 24, and you can see it's bigger than that. So 30 is pounds per acre seeding rate maybe is acceptable for Sandpoint. That's why you're looking at these differences. A lot of times that 8 to 12 pounds works for many species, as you'll see, because the recommended seeding rate for a pure stand, if you're looking at pounds, is the bracketed numbers all the way down here. So my apologies for not bringing that up. But is difference in seed size for the different forage varieties. This is available on the internet. You just look up Alberta Forage Seed Manual, and away you go. It'll appear for you, and then you go to page 160 to find this. I use this table all the time because if I want a stand to be pure alfalfa, I aim for 8 pounds. If I want it to be half alfalfa, as I would here, or even there, I'm showing you how I calculate it. I'm putting about 1/3 of each species and showing I use those pure stand seeding rates, those numbers there off that page to determine 1/3. So 1/3 of 8, I need 2.6 pounds per acre. And I'm hoping this is pure live seeds or close to 85 or greater % germination. So note, seeding method, germination, pure live seed aren't noted. They need to be considered though. This is trying to make it easy for you to look at. If a Metabrome stand, and the table actually had 14 pounds, but I went with 16 because I felt more comfortable just with my own experience. Orchard grass, 6 pounds. These are not coated grasses. Remember, if they were coated, I would have bumped the Metabrome by 25%. I'd have put 20 pounds if it was coated Metabrome. I'd have taken 6 times 25%, and I'd have increased 6 pounds to almost 7.5, I think it is, if I'm looking at a 25% more. But I can calculate what I need in total. I know I need 2.6 pounds, 5.3, 2.6. So if I added them all up, I've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.5 pounds. So I need 10.5 pounds of this mixture so I can make my own mix, as long as it's not coated, of these. And I can make my own mixture. I can order my own seed. I can do my own thing and be in control of my own destiny. Easy enough to figure out in your head. If you want to go further, the seeding rate calculator in Forage UPIC, highly recommend you plug in the numbers. It takes a little more effort, but you are going to get a calculation done for you. You can take to a seed company or ask the seed company, in fact, to do it for you. Tell them you want this percentage in a mixture. And when you say percentage, you say, this is what I want % of a stand. You'll always have Mother Nature playing with your % of a stand. So don't ever presume it's going to be exact. And at the same time, if somebody says, I want a 50-50 stand, they're not talking seed weight. They're talking percentage of the stand. I want it to be half alfalfa, half grass. They're talking % by seed. If you're going to use a cover crop, I thought I'd cover this, and I'm going to put it in fairly quickly because it's important to look at all of these in concert. So if you're putting in a cover crop, it is more important than ever that you're going to understand a principle of competition and keep the competition managed to be more low. feed the competition less than they want, so they're not as competitive, and get it out of the way early. Plan on getting it out early. And the idea behind that is allow for the seeds to be seedlings and express enough growth potential prior to killing frost, prior to dry conditions. And that's where the cover crop comes in. And people say, should you use a cover crop or not? Well, it's up to you. And to be honest, if you manage it well, I do prefer silage even over green feed, because I've heard horror stories of green feed sitting out there for 3 weeks as it rained. And they're asking me, what do you think happened to the seedlings under it? They died. That's what happened to them. Remember the cover, canopy cover, oil in an engine leaking out. You have no time to spare. That's why I prefer the silage. Or as one person said to me, I didn't mean to silage it, but I cut it for green feed, but in the end, we wrapped it and got it off there. And that was simply because the weather didn't permit. So with a cover crop, manage for all of these simultaneously. And one of the sets of work, and I apologize to Dan Cole for not giving him the credit for it. Dan Cole was with Alberta Agriculture and did a lot of marvelous work. So if I'm not mistaken, this was in the Westlock area even. But the idea of no crop and being weedy, no crop and herbicides being used, no crop and silage and grain, tons per acre of production that in year one, as you can see, there's literally no production. But the opportunity in year one to get a small production, and I can't tell you where Dan seeded this, because there's a good chance this was seeded maybe towards the end of May or something, maybe June. So anyway, we can get, and as you're starting to see what's happening here, if you dealt with it as no cover crop and used herbicides, if you use silage in year two, if you use grain in year two, and grain surprisingly was even better than silage, but my apologies. In year three, you're starting to see a bit of a pattern develop where there is something in the range of 1/4 to 1/2 ton difference in total productivity of an alfalfa brome stand that had a barley companion crop planted on it. This work was done by the West Central Forage Association, 4 years with no fertilizer, looking at longevity. What they found after 4 years in grams per meter squared was where we had 350, here we had over 500. That's about 20% probably higher yield on a stand with no cover crop. That's something that you have to manage the weeds and control the situation immensely with no cover crop. But it's something that majority of people that are looking at continuous seedings and getting successes continually, they choose no cover crop. It's not to say you shouldn't, that's up to you. But it is important to realize the ramifications of cover crops. And if you can't control the moisture, you certainly need to control some of the things we're going to talk about. Make sure you've got enough seed. And the reason why is this is very disappointing, but usually 1/3 of the seed will produce seedlings and about half survive year one. That is something that Barnes Edel had come up with. It's something that Arvid Austin, who co-wrote the forage manual, would tell me, Grant, you've got to realize that that's why we're seeing more. That's why it's so important that when we have seedling losses, why? Why is there so much seeding losses? Management, unfortunately, poor seed to soil contact. That means I don't have a firm seed bed. Limited food reserve, slow growth. I didn't fertilize properly. Soil dries before root reaches moisture. Well, we could say it didn't rain, or we can say, you know what? That seedling couldn't suck air. And it can't. It can't suck water through air well. It can suck water around soil particles. packed, well-packed seed bed. That is the key thing for soil contact. Seeding too deep, well, it never got to the surface. It never made it up there. You know what, though? When I looked at a lot of this, I started to think to myself, seedling damage is fine, but I thought to myself, you know what? I think some of this is really a non-packed seed bed, really firm before seeding, is actually what these three components are. So 3 of the top 4 are simply, in my mind, I didn't have an avoidance mechanism in terms of having a firm, well-packed seed bed. Remember, as I said, oil in the car, canopy cover, water is more like a rad hose breaking. We do have a bit of time for the root and everything to survive as long as photosynthesis is feeding the plant. For seedlings, remember, this is one of the things why coating does make sense in many ways, because absorbing its own weight in water before germination, some seed coatings that are starch-based can absorb up to 600 times their weight in water. So that is a key to try to really help get a seedling moisture imbibed, adequate moisture, and that seed to soil contact being so key. And remember, this firm prior. I say to people, you know what? Firm prior. I want you to remember this. Don't forget this. It's not firm after. Firming it up after is like letting the horse out of the barn and then closing the door. Firm prior is crucial. You cannot seed shallow if you don't have a firm seed bed. I defy you. Just do it. And if you can, then you really had to do your homework and dealt with it. And that was maybe even more important than anything. So prior and after, somebody said, I firmed it up afterwards. Well, if you pulled a roller over it when that seed was put in a row by a drill that was 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep or 1/2 to 1 inch deep, you might have moved 10 inches a row of dirt in between all over what was a sunken 2 inch deep, 1/4 inch depth seeding. Between rows, the mound of dirt now got moved over it. So watch, at times you can't do it after, but most times you do, and that is intentional and important to do it after. But remember, I have had a failing where a guy said, I've never ruined a failing with harrowing, but the challenge was the young fella that seeded said, but Grandpa, the seed bed was way too soft. I knew it when I seeded it. And that's why I did a really good job of seeding shallow and with a firm press drill wheel right behind every row. But the distance between those 10-inch rows had 3 inches higher dirt, and so higher harrowed over. Seed bed preparation, just really look, firm is being driven home here. Footprints, that is so shallow. Wow, eh? The point of that is ideal seed beds actually are stubble. A crop stubble is fine. Chemical fallow, summer fallow, unworked in the spring because the winter snows and rains have packed it. And then do watch in certain areas, because I did have a fellow saying I seeded, then a big windstorm came up, and we've got all of the stubble that was harrowed and laying on the ground, laying in the ditch. Or a big rainstorm, I got a bunch of material down at the bottom. Well, standing stubble would have done a better job of protecting. If we're using a companion crop, try to use something that isn't so competitive and that's seeded 1/2 to 1/3 of the rate. This is Myron Bjorgi when he was sink no deeper than your boot heel, showing firmness with his tracks and with his car. And do it right the first time, Myron would say. More seed does not make up for failing to do it right. You can't have it as an afterthought, Myron said. You missed my point, firm before. And I accented that for that. Notice how the moistures come up to the surface in Myron's situation. Firm enough packed so moisture comes also towards it and for it. The key thing I said to people is how confident you know. Too often people have said to me, well, I seed is shallow. Well, if it's coated, we'll go out there, and if I dig up the seed, I find out it's 1.5 inches deep. And it's a colored seed, so you can find it. And the guy's going, well, I told a guy to seed shallow. Well, yes, I guess telling is one thing. Be careful that you'll make sure that you're setting it up in the field. I can't support this enough. I have to put this is the reason I've seen so many failings, been part of forage seed establishment issues, and why it's a crapshoot with forages. Remember, these seedlings can't handle a lot of depth. They don't have a lot of energy in themselves. And when we're looking at this, realizing that we really have to seed for that shallow depth. I'm going to bounce over this a bit. I just wanted to show you something. The seedling germination and how different it is when we're to 1 3/8 inches. Our seeding germinations drop more markedly. And when we look at our grasses, even from high to really low. Again, the point. I'm going to have to move, but firmness of seed bed. We do need seedling growth or height. So if somebody says, how big do I need? I'll say to people, well, it could be about 3 to 4 inches of height. It could be the 2-leaf stage for alfalfa and 3-leaf for grasses, or grasses 2 to 3-leaf stage. So my apologies, 2-leaf for alfalfa. If I get a quick snow, as we did this fall down my way, I can maybe handle less, but I really need 6 to 8 weeks of good growth to get here. And a -4 degrees frost at night is going to stop everything. So that's why I want the sod seeding equipment, seeding into sod, whatever method, and I'm switching to sod now, because those of you that look, any method can work in sod, but a lot of people are buying these drills because of the closure behind the rows. It is crucially important. As you can see here, there's ruts left. I can only look here and hope that this press drill wheel, and I don't want to do much. I don't want to harrow this. I want to leave that covered and everything, or hope Mother Nature through the winter will do something for me. Great manual available on the internet. And of course, this webinar is recorded for you. This is a tremendous manual. It's got probably 150 years. I hate to say how old some of these people are. But, you know, when you've got people here like Dwayne McCartney, Mike Schellenberg, Harvey Yoder, as many of you maybe know from Lac La Biche, 35 years experience in each year, over 100 already. They put all of their data into this. However, what Harvey Yoder had shared at Lacombe Pasture School was, you know something, and the only thing I'm going to say here is that this is so true. So you really have to do everything right. And Harvey's comment, and we shared in our first session about choosing plants and rejuvenation, my apologies, last week, is so important to look at even considering maybe we just take it out of forages, prepare a perfect seed bed, as Greg Selzler, a producer at Mayerthorpe, had commented, with the many years of forage seeding success with any method is I'm preparing 2 years in advance. And Harvey said, maybe we take it out of production and put it into something for 2 years so we know we've got a great seed bed. And if you don't have the right grasses to begin with, and often the case when somebody says, I'm going to sod seed because I'm really unhappy with the stand, it's a bunch of fine grasses, it's soddy, that is the hardest one to succeed with. And the key point also that I found it many times, what are you going to do different? You need to pause because somebody needs to answer this before you go on. Sod seeding for perennial pasture rejuvenation. Again, Paul Jefferson, Terry Kowalczyk, great work done. What they said is we really need vegetation control. Avoid water stress. So try to pick your spots is what they said. Look at it from a different soil zone. From the southern Alberta, maybe I don't even try it. If I'm up at Lac La Biche, maybe I choose to do so because my soil moisture this year maybe was adequate. This fall, it probably isn't, right? So concerns to doing it if I was doing it. Most species, red clover is actually the most predictable, even above alfalfa, but people don't think red clover lasts long enough. So then they mention alfalfa thereafter. And yes, alfalfa is a pretty predictable legume considered. Slicer milk vetch, they're looking at all adding for pastures. Slicer milk vetch in wetter areas and in quite drier areas, I've even found. So, but pick your spots. Sandfoin needs more research. Zero-till seeding equipment. The work that Paul Jefferson looked at different openers and everything, and it's available on the site at the Western Beef Forage Center of Excellence, and starter fertilizer phosphorus. That's what they're emphasizing as a recipe. Again, the depth. The seeder must be adjusted properly. And I found I couldn't get row closure when I did it with a certain type of seeder. I don't want to say which one because I don't want to pick on it. But that's where I should have done it in the fall, where maybe Mother Nature in the winter would have helped me. You can't seed it to kingdom come and expect it to grow out of the ground from depth. So if I don't like the seed bed, if I think it's too soddy, I'm sorry, I got to seed it shallow. So do it in the fall, hopefully to have spring. Set it back with glyphosate so you have better success. More seed does not make it up for doing it wrong. And as Greg Selsler had said in his, and I've got to move along pretty quick because my time's coming up, any of these can help. And I've certainly used a number of these. I watched Dwayne McCartney use an aerator in fall and get success over the course of 3 years. Just took a little while. I've seen people using a heavy chain harrow. They needed 5/8 inch and set at the most aggressive setting, got very good success with red clover alfalfa. Another kind of a harrow, and Jim Bauer at Acme has been playing with vertical tillage, he and Jerry Berg, and doing some experiments. So they'll have some data for somebody to play with. But again, it's another type of getting some soil over it. How do we go about doing it? And remember, in many cases, it's also setting back, because if you're bucking a stacked deck, and that's what existing plants are, I'd rather have that stacked deck laying on the floor. And that's why I use glyphosate for. So remember, above and around competition, weather timing. So maybe it is seeding in late November, or sorry, early November, late October, so that you've got many weather moisture events ahead of you. Maybe it is hitting with glyphosate so that it's going to be set back in spring when I've got mineralization of soil and my glyphosate controlled below ground. The one thing I've ran into, and management for success is thereafter, bare soil, but what's below? You get into some stands that are crested wheatgrass, Russian wild rye, immense root system in Russian wild rye below ground. Well, you know what? There might not be things above ground, but why isn't anything growing above ground? It's because they can't stand the competition below ground of the root system. Overgrazing suppression, and I think they've done a pretty good job here, as we can see. But as a young, Sean McGrath at Vermilion, Lloydminster area said, and many maybe know him, he said, I grazed it once really hard and seeded, but you know what? Once does not make failings of an ecosystem. So the existing stand that Sean had managed for so well, for so long, did come back fast. If I beat it up like a horse pasture, I'm sorry to the horse people for saying this, I own horses too, I maybe have a good chance. Suppression, the phosphorus being key, and looking at the PKS, timing it very early in the spring. Maybe it is the last part of April. Maybe I'm hazarding getting out there just prior to spring green up. So the 3rd week in April, maybe it's the 4th week in April at Bonnyville. I don't know, but I'm getting out there to address green up growth and getting into a situation for greatest competition success, accepting frost risk as part of it, very late. So that, and again, if I'm going to seed shallow or maybe even above ground and use some of those kicking the dirt over it systems we shared, but seeding deep is not a solution to take. Dirt tight around the seed for moisture imbibing, for sucking moisture through depth. Herbicide suppression, 1/3 of a liter of active ingredient. So 1 liter of 360 active ingredient, or going with 2/3 to 1 liter of 540 gram per active ingredient is Roundup, or some of the others do have 540. Other products have 360. That's why I'm saying for suppression, 1/3 of a liter of active ingredient for suppression. If you really want to nail it and take its socks off, then you're looking at going with that full liter, 1.5 liters of active ingredient. That's where you're going to get really strong kill. If you want to remove a stand and seed into sod, knowing that it's going to be seeding maybe a swath grazing, as we talked about last week, or seeding new grasses, not just new legumes, but seeding new grasses with it to get around existing grasses being present. I'm sorry, they're still going to try to come at you. I know they will. And the reason why is we know that when we use glyphosate, and the fall application of glyphosate is the best, spring is not as good at controlling. But a fall application, when it was used, and you can see application of 1 liter, so this is suppression in September. But when we look at orchard grass, it didn't do a good job of suppression down the road. We look at meadow brome grass, it didn't do so great a job. Creeping red fescue, it didn't do anything. I hazard to say many of our fine grasses could be Kentucky bluegrass, and I believe it would be much harder in Kentucky bluegrass. I know some people debate that with me, but it is a different plant. And I do believe I can get better control with Kentucky bluegrass, with glyphosate, with a suppression rating even. But that's the point to suppression. You're setting it back, but many of your good grasses are going to come back at you because there's hardly any suppression, no suppression to the point. I did want to show you this one. I got to wrap quick. What is interesting about this is phosphorus and herbicide suppression. Sod seeding, 57% of plants in June of the following year, evaluating over the 2 following years. Phosphate, as you can see, helped in every situation with success. Herbicide is intriguing because the broadcast seeding, percent of plants only 30. So why did the airway and the drag beat out a sod seeding? I'd guess this was seeded deeper, too deep. Why did it lose out here? So this airway or drag system in broadcast couldn't seed too deep. So it is something to remember. Phosphorus and not seeding too deep is everything in establishment. And we talked about these 4 times seeding. So there. All I wanted to say is frost seeding, you need a really heavy wet clay soil. And if you don't have a heavy wet clay soil, it doesn't heave. It doesn't move with frost. When they talk about Ontario and the success of frost seeding, or in the US, they're talking about 30, 40 inches of rainfall in Missouri. Ontario, very wet clay soils. Frost heaves when it's a heavy clay. If it's sandy or loamy, it doesn't. Again, good seed bed, very shallow, monitor, timely actions for control. That is, to me, very important. The reality of his success, I need 3 to 5 plants per square foot for optimum production. So when somebody says, what do you have in your stand? If it's uniform 3 to 5, I wish it was in most cases, but unfortunately it's often 3 to 5 on the hills 1 to 2 in patches in the valley, soft soil valley, not seeded too deep, hilltops. Do look at how you do things. Anything can be a failing. Too much fertilizer banded with the seed with a Flexicoil 6000. This is mine, so it's my failing. In the end, I actually found success. You can see the row closure being really good. I went out and broadcasted in the fall and used animals to tramp in yellow blossomed alfalfa, which is many seeds per pound, 300,000, as I said. So when I'm putting on a pound, I've got about 6 seeds a square foot. And I used animals to tramp it in October, November, and that stand came. It was a little slow, but I did get success in between, and some of the others came because it's just I made my own challenges. I guess I'm going to, the other one is some people talk about feeding things to animals. Yes, there is success with doing it. And the reality is that an animal eating seed gets about 50% of the seed likely through itself. And there is a bit of history behind that. And when you start looking, I think it was 78 square feet we figured out with 11 to 13 and looking at 0.5 to 1 and looking at it being a fertilizer spreader for a number of days. So with those defecations, so yes, seed that is, and you buy it by the hard seed lot, hopefully, but Okemo Mancanier, when he did work feeding Anik alfalfa, yellow blossom, and Sicer milk vetch, did find this data that the majority of seed comes through in about 1 to 1.5 days, or later, actually, he did find. But yes, there was quite a bit of success, and 77%, 7 to 70 cents, depending on seedings. I count on my Sicer milk vetch almost every fall with a light spring grazing in June to set seed for myself to be a seed bank when the animals eat it, and the animals were eating it up to yesterday on a paddock and spreading it. Now they're moving it east of my house as they're bale grazing and spreading it out there. So it's in the manure. You see those seeds are developed enough in those hard pods. Many legumes will do it, not just Sicer. Sainfoin does it well. And you can see the little seedlings coming in the manure. And these are clover seedlings. They're actually red clover because of those watermarks. They're not white clover because they got hairs on them. But you can see it coming in the manure from the previous fall. So feeding to animals is an expensive way to do it, to be honest with you. But it is a way, especially if you have your own existing stand that's got seed set in it, you can get animals to move it yourself and save yourself cost. Do use quality seed of suitable forage species. Do ask them about inoculating legumes. Yes, some companies maybe do illegally, but the fact is some of the majority of our legumes are not inoculated. The life of a stand is affected by the start. And as I said, the firm seed bed, then seed shallow is crucial before any kind of packing or after. There are times when you should pack. Other times, a fellow said to me, I harrowed once aggressively after broadcasting. You know what? When I turned around the second time to harrow with the heavy set of harrows aggressively, start pulling it up. I stopped. I want to show you that corner 2 years later. And he's so right. The circle he made pulled up seed. So it's monitoring. It's you deciding what you're doing. And as you're doing that, you're also managing. And I do say to people, the bottom line, when you're managing and you're not seeing it coming, the grasshoppers aren't eating it. Be patient, because I have seen seeds come 1.5 years later. And with one person up at Fairview, they said to me, it's 3 years ago. I said, well, I'm sorry, I can't see success at all. When I asked them about it a year after, they grazed the competition severely in the spring, in April, into May, and pulled the animals in June. And that stand, she said to me, came like you wouldn't believe. So be careful about calling a seeding a failure when you're monitoring and doing a lot of things right. I'll stop there, Megan, and I've taken my time and more. So thank you for putting up with me. And if you've got any questions or if you need to go, I understand.
Awesome. Thank you, Grant. If anybody has any questions, they can put them in the Q&A box or in the chat.
I guess I should. I'll put that up to make sure you get it. It'll be recorded. Take advantage of any questions. Do look at the video. The Lakeland Applied Research Association was part of that project across the province in the twofold steps of it. In the first, where they planted a sandfoin to look at it and its success over time. And then when they got a producer and did it on a field scale to do it as well. And so that project and that result. Any questions, Megan, or did I wear people out?
We have a few comments. So Leona says, thank you for all the great information. And Michael asked if the recorded sessions will be available on the website. Yes, we'll put them on the website, and we will also put them on our YouTube page. So watch out for that. They'll probably be on our website and YouTube page early next week. So we have one question. We turned over an old hayfield and had oats in it this year. For putting it back into hay, we wanted to broadcast and then harrow. Should that be rolled?
You had it. Say it one more time, Megan, for me, please.
We turned over an old hayfield and had oats in this year. For putting it back into hay, we wanted to broadcast and then harrow. Should that be rolled?
Okay, thank you. If you haven't cultivated it, you actually got a really good seed bed. It's right there in front of you. The challenge is I almost, if I haven't used glyphosate, like a 2-year break. And the reason why is I know the competitive nature of some of these roots that are in the soil from different grasses. And with a 2-year break in annuals, oats, green feed, whatever you choose, grain, and then step back in, success is a lot more easy. The idea, if you're not happy with a seed bed, yes, roll it in advance. Yes, pack it in advance prior to the drill even coming out, prior to broadcasting, because I do want it firm beforehand. I don't want a soft seed bed, then broadcast on, then harrow packed and rolled. I really want that firmness to begin with to be firm below seed, and then I'm going to firm it up above seed. So I do look at the fact that if I'm going to broadcast on that land, if it was cultivated, then definitely consider rolling. If you said, I'm going to seed this next year, I really want to put it back into forages, I have no choice, I need the hay, I would say to you, if you cultivate it, you're going to have to pack the dickens out of it, whatever way you can prior to seeding anyway. So yeah, using a roller when it's sitting there, pull it out, roll the land, then seed into it thereafter. And as one fellow said, I ran my double disc press drill across it and banded phosphorus. Then I wasn't happy. So I went ahead and I used a set of crowfoot packers on it to pack it one more time. And then I seeded into it with a Brilliant. So the packing part is really crucial before, yes. Do whatever that constitutes principles.
It was cultivated.
then definitely you want to get it firm beforehand in some way possible, and rolling it once or twice even. Or harrow packing, depending on the type of packers you've got and methods. Coil packers, I know at times pack, but even harrows pack. But the fact is, I really hope you've broken down the sod well enough that the root pieces are going to allow for that little seedling. So if you're sitting in springtime and it's not raining, it's wet, and your subsoil moisture is not good, choosing to seed it, you better be an optimist and expect rain. It doesn't mean it won't, but that's what you're going to need in that situation, because the perennial stand is taking moisture out of the soil in April and May and September, October for many years prior. So you're using this year to bank moisture for your success next year. And if you have no subsoil moisture, as I believe somebody up in your area said right now, you're bucking a stacked deck right off the bat. So you're really counting on spring rains to get success with a small seed. Definitely needing that.
If anybody has more questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Thank you once again, Grant, so much for doing this webinar series. I know personally I learned a lot, and yeah, look for these recordings on our website and on our YouTube page.
Well, all right, I'm going to run then. So I wish you all the best of